Welcome to Conversations with the Pastor, the hippest show in the Pacific Northwest, where we talk about current events and things that matter to you. We're here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Now listen, this is an interactive conversation. That means we need you to ask questions via Facebook or pastorconversations at the nbcf.org. Don't miss out. Now let's start the conversation. Pastor?
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Conversations with the Pastor. We're coming up on Christmas on Monday of next week. And when we look scripturally at what we as Christians would call the first Christmas, you had a child born against the backdrop of the cry of mothers with children dying in the backdrop because of a king's policy of genocide to try and root out what he feared would be a rival, a political rival, and was willing to kill a whole generation of kids to get at one. Christmas has always seemingly been lived out against the backdrop of traumatic geopolitical unfoldings, and this year is no different. When we look at our daily news, there across the globe, there are many hot spots where there's suffering and humanitarian crisis and political unease, but the one that has been most salient and in the news most constantly over the past few months has been the war between Israel and Hamas. Tonight, we want to address that issue in earnest, and I have invited some new friends to be a part of that conversation who are far more familiar and grounded in the issue than am I. And so tonight, my guests via Zoom are Dr. Alice Rothschild, who is a physician, an author, and a filmmaker who is on the steering committee of Jewish Voice for Peace's Health Advisory Council. She is also the mentor liaison for, quote, We Are Not Numbers, unquote, which is a group that mentors young Gazan writers and recently received media coverage because of one of the co-founders, Palestinian professor and poet Rafit Al-Arir, who was murdered by the Israeli military. Dr. Alice was last in the region in August of this year. We also have Sabrina O'Day, and she is a Seattle-raised Palestinian American with family in the West Bank. As the daughter of Palestinian refugee parents who have been longtime activists in the community, Sabrina started her advocacy at a young age and continues this lifelong struggle. She currently works at the International Rescue Committee and as an anti-trafficking response network advocate. In addition, she co-founded Baladna, a new Palestinian-led organization seeking to unify and advocate for the Palestinian community in Washington State. Ladies, welcome to Conversations with the Pastor.
It's good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
As we talked a little bit before our program started tonight, let's go back before October 7th to October 6th. And from your various perspectives, what was life like on both sides of the Israel-Gaza border on October 6th? And how did whatever you perceive to have been the status quo, how did it get there? And I'll let whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump in if you want. So physically, on October 6th, Gaza was and still is a 6 by 26 mile strip of land that has the Mediterranean on one side, Israel around two sides, and Egypt on the fourth side. And it was under strict siege, which means that The Israeli government controlled everything that went in, that went out. They controlled the sea, they controlled the air, they controlled electricity. It was completely blockaded. And so you had 2.3 million people with a very, very high level of poverty because of the crushing of the economy, and also a very well-educated population. You have 8 refugee camps, and about 70% of Gazans are refugees from the 1948 war. And there's a big military terminal called Erez, which was in the north of Gaza, and that's where like when I went into Gaza in August, I went through Erez. There were also several checkpoints along the eastern border. It's not really a border, the eastern fence, where materials and food and imports and that kind of thing could go in and out. Again, strictly controlled by the Israeli government. And in the south, you had a checkpoint at Rafah, which was the way that people got in and out of Egypt. So it was poverty-stricken and sort of surviving very barely because of this blockade. Now, the blockade came into being after the 2004 election of Hamas, and there was international uproar around this, and ultimately after a civil war between Hamas and Fatah, which is the other major party, the international community led by the US and Israel decided to have this strict siege in their attempt to get rid of Hamas, even though Hamas was democratically elected. Now, if we want to go back a little bit more, this all became occupied territory in the war in 1967, when it's called the Six-Day War, when Israel seized control of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. If we want to go back a little bit more, we could go back to 1948, which is the very pivotal war, where after the creation of the State of Israel through the United Nations, there was a war between the various surrounding Arab countries and the Israeli forces. And the war was, it's called the War of Liberation in Israel. What other people who see other dimensions of this see that there was an indigenous Palestinian community of Muslims, Christians, and a few Jewish people who had been living there under the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, and that the problem really started when Jewish immigrants fleeing anti-Semitism came to historic Palestine. But instead of coming to share the land, they came to take over the land. And so this has been a long history of what we consider settler colonialism, of people moving into another region and then claiming the land to themselves and basically driving everyone else out. So those are the very, very quick outline of the history. There's a lot of complexity to it, but I think we should move on to Sabrina now.
Well, before we move on to Sabrina, Dr. Alice, and Dr. Alice has given me permission to refer to her as Dr. Alice, as opposed to the more tongue-tying Dr. Alice Rothschild.
Always gets screwed
to be
up.
formal and casual all at the same time, but I want to make sure that people don't think on a gender basis that I am I'm disrespecting you professionally. So, Dr. Rothschild, as a Jewish person, certainly your perspective is not what I have experienced to be the normative perspective, a very progressive perspective, and you know in the Jewish scriptures, the prophet, the seer, was always a minority perspective. And so you're a prophetic voice within your community, and my reading of the scriptures is that the prophets were never appreciated in their day and time. Retrospectively, somebody looked back and said, this person got it. But when you're the person who gets it before others get it, you really catch it. So what has life been like for you being the prophet?
Well, I don't know that I'm actually a prophet, but I did grow up in a traditional Jewish family. I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week. I had a bat mitzvah. My family went to Israel when I was 14, and it was just this magical trip to the homeland. So I do come from that place. I began to change my understanding as a child of the 60s. And when I began to learn about, colonialism and imperialism and all these different political forces. So that kind of opened my eyes up that the story that I had heard in Hebrew school and had heard from my parents and my grandparents didn't really reflect the whole issue. And so what I did in the 1990s was to get involved with a number of other Jewish folks who were struggling over this to try to get ourselves educated. And we started inviting Palestinians. I was in Boston then to just tell us their story. We began reading Israeli historians and Palestinian historians, and very rapidly got a very, very different picture. And when we tried to share this with our communities, we were shunned pretty quickly. So I was, I was very quickly aware that having an unpopular position like this would mean that I couldn't be in the tent. I've been very fortunate to find a community of Jewish people and Jewish allies who share my political philosophy, and in fact, who I learned from, as well as Palestinians and non-Palestinians who also share this. So I have found my own community, but in terms of the mainstream Jewish community, it's very tough to be part of that community and have the political ideas that I have. And people find it very threatening. And so I spend a lot of energy working on that issue because I think Jewish trauma and cultural trauma is something that my community has to deal with. And unfortunately, the way it seems to me is that for many Jewish Americans, they're not really very religious. They go to temple on Yom Kippur kind of Jews. So the religion for Jewish people in this country has been the love of Israel. So people feel very threatened when you say, wait a minute, how could it be a democracy when 20% of the population is second class? Or how can it be a democracy when there's the occupied territories and there are people that are very oppressed? That it sort of threatens a core belief. So this is a really difficult, challenging topic in the Jewish community. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to engage in conversation.
Well, I do appreciate your sentiments as an African American. I understand what it is to come from a community of trauma, and I also understand what it is when you provide internal critique to that community of trauma. It's not very well received at times.
Right.
So
I always say you have to live with the Holocaust, not in the Holocaust, and that's a very big distinction that is very hard for my community.
I'm going to remember that line. I will quote you the first 2 times I use it.
It's yours. It's yours.
Selena, what's your perspective on that? October 6th, what was life like and how did it get there? We've heard from Dr. Alice. How about you?
Yeah, I think this question kind of made me want to laugh at myself and cry at the same time, because I don't remember, honestly, even the September, the beginning of October, I don't remember what I was doing. The last 2 months have felt like years, honestly. I think many Palestinians are really struggling to balance being thrown into the most intense activism I think we've seen in a really long time for our community. Also, for some of us, school, for some of us, work, for some of us, family obligations, and it's just been a lot. So I think October 6th seems like a really, really long, it was really far away at this point. But I can tell you about before that. I actually had the honor of visiting home for the first time in about 13 years this summer. I have family in Bethlehem, and so we were able to go, and I took my husband for the first time, and it was a really incredible experience. I think it's making this the last 2 months a little bit harder for me, just because I was there so recently. And Dr. Alice, I think that you can definitely attest to just feeling like maybe things were sort of more normal than they are now. Seems like not too long ago. So I think there's a lot to say there. I think there's a lot to unpack, but I want to kind of finish what Dr. Alice started and take it further than 1948, actually, because I think this is kind of important context as well. Prior to 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel, which Dr. Alice, you described as the War of Liberation, I believe.
That's what Israelis call it. Yes.
That's what Israelis
I
call it.
don't
Yes,
call it
yes.
that. Yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to remember exactly what the quote
Yeah.
you used. For Palestinians, we actually call their Independence Day in May the Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe, because that was the day that marked the establishment of a settler state for the Palestinian people. Over 750,000 Palestinians were exiled from their home, including my grandparents, all four of my grandparents and their families. My grandmother, who's still alive today and lives here in Seattle, she was 10 years old when she was, or 12 years old when she was expelled from her home in El Malha, which is just on the southern part of Jerusalem. And so she still remembers it. So it wasn't as long ago, I think, as people think 1948 really is. People are still alive that remember the Nakba and the establishment of the State of Israel. But what I really wanted to take us back to actually was the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration. Because I think when we talk about settler colonialism, a lot of times we think about wars or seeing the acts of colonization or the acts of people coming in and taking homes or even active genocides. But what we don't see are the backroom dealings of colonizers, right? And so I wanted to take us back to 1916, I believe, to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the British and the French essentially divided the land of the Levant. So Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And they put borders in place. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Egypt too.
And Egypt. And they put borders in place, whereas before that, there was freedom of movement. For hundreds and hundreds of years, people moved freely as they needed to for food, for to find work, for their families, whatever that it needed to be. So this idea of land borders was a very kind of nuanced Western perspective, especially for the Middle East. So you had the British and the French come in, split the land, and decide who they were going to occupy. So Palestine actually became under British rule at the time. My grandparents have identification cards, and my grandfather's last name was actually changed to sound more British than Arab, right? So these are like kind of the little things in colonization we don't necessarily think about, but make a difference, right? In the following year, there was the Balfour Declaration, which essentially was a letter by the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour. And he essentially, I'm really summing this up. I encourage you all to go
It's a lot of history, right?
Yeah, and read it more in depth. But essentially, he promised the land of Palestine to create a state for the Jewish people. So think about how far away 1917 is from 1948. This was decades in the making. And so when you start to think about, migrants coming into the land of Palestine, for many of the generations before us, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, for many of them, there were a lot of migrants, Jewish and non-Jewish migrants, that were welcomed in the region because, again, there was freedom of movement. There are people flowing from the North African region over to Spain, into Asia. There was constant movement of people. And now at the hands of colonization, there are strict protocols, there are borders, there are all of these different things that make it difficult for people to coexist. And so you'll hear a lot of the times we'll say, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in peace and harmony. And, people don't live in peace and harmony. I mean, that's not necessarily the human reality, but relative peace and harmony, right? This is the Holy Land. There is places for worship for Muslims. There's places of worship for Jews and for Christians alike. And so I think kind of tying it all back in, just to take it back down to a personal level, I think one of the most incredible parts of our trip this last summer going to Palestine was seeing the Dome of the Rock, or the Aqsa, in Jerusalem, but also being able to take my husband, whose family is Christian, to be able to take him to the Church of Nativity and to be able to see such an historic space that he grew up hearing about his whole life. I think that was like an incredible moment for him. So we're talking about a land that's really precious for all of our communities, right?
I think when you go back to 1916 and certainly 1948, I've often said in addressing these issues, there were two nations born in 1948, and they were both defined, citizenship was defined by race, and that was South Africa and apartheid, and that was the state of Israel, where both of them, where race defined who's in, who's not. And one side declared independence, and the other side, it was a catastrophe. It was a catastrophe for Black South Africans. But to take it back further, when you look at the establishment of Bantustans in South Africa, when Dutch immigrants moved into South Africa and put in a framework for minority rule, and then look at Jewish settlers moving into the area of Palestine, but then look at European settlers coming to the North American mainland and what happened after that and the removal of native peoples. It follows a similar paradigm.
It's not really race for the Jewish settlers, because there were Jews from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, from Africa, from Arab countries. It's more a cultural, religious identification.
Yes.
So we should be really careful to not think that Jewish people are a race. I think that's a little
Can you help us with this term? Because non-Jewish people, I remember talking with some rabbis, and I really struggled with what did they mean when they say Jewish, because as African American, there's no such thing as a non-practicing African American. And I'm just African American. But if you want to go from Christian, then I'm telling you about my religion, and I can be of any race and be of my religion, and I can be of any religion and be my race. So when Jewish people say they're Jewish, are you giving me a cultural identity? Are you giving me a religious identity? Are you giving me a racial identity? Because I've heard it used in all three iterations, and I don't know what people mean when they say Jewish.
So the one thing I would say, that it is not a racial identity, that when people say that they're Jewish, they sometimes mean they're religiously Jewish, or they're culturally Jewish, or they have some ethnic identification with Jewish people. It's a very broad, loose definition, because you can be a Jew from Iraq, and you can be a Jew from Poland, and you can be a Jew from Eritrea. So it's racial is just one of the categories it's not, but it has more to do with religion, culture. It's like, I'm a Jewish person, but I'm not a religious Jewish person, but I'm very culturally, historically Jewish. My grandfather and all my grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe. My grandfather worked in a sweatshop. He was Orthodox. You know, I mean, there's a certain, I'm in the branch that's called the Ashkenazi branch, which means the people who came from Eastern Europe. There are also Jews who came from Spain, from Africa, from Arab countries, and those people are the Mizrahi or the Sephardim. So there are different kind of branches of Judaism, or Jewish people, but it's a messy category. It's not something that has one, if you have to be religious to be a Jew. It's just much more loose than that.
So you need context to really understand what people are meaning in a particular moment by
Right.
the characterization.
And this is constantly debated, particularly in Israel, because in Israel, the sort of definition of what is a Jew is defined by the ultra-Orthodox rabbinic groups. So that, for instance, if you convert in Israel and your conversion is with a Reform rabbi, that doesn't count, because the rules are that it has to be Orthodox. So, it's very full of politics and messiness and belief systems and all that kind of stuff.
The 1917 world that you mentioned, Selena, it was a world in which colonialism was the state of affairs, where European nations had colonized almost the entire planet, and almost every person of color anywhere in the globe was under the colonization of one of the European tribes. And so what hit the Middle East also the Berlin Conference 1880 and the carving up of Africa without the respect for tribal boundaries and identities. And that's underneath all of the political instability you have today. Tribal identities and boundaries versus nation state. We've seen it in Central and Southern Africa. And so we've seen it here in North America. So essentially we see the chaos of toxic European Christianity impacting the globe, that most of our modern day struggles is still the legacy of toxic European Christianity. And as a Christian person, I have to make that critique of the last half millennia of what Christians have done when the cross and the sword went together all over the world and just carved up the world with impunity for non-white people. Is that accurate?
But I think they did it in the name of Christianity, right?
Yes.
When we look at actually what it is that they're doing, it is geopolitical interest.
Yeah, it's not Christian at all.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times it's important for me to clarify as a Muslim. A lot of times, especially in the last 20 years, I've been asked to defend my religion, or I've been asked to, like, as a Muslim, what do you think about this? And I'm like, these are people who are doing things in the name of a religion. This is not what actually is reflected in our religion. And so I think it's always important to kind of differentiate what it is that's happening. But you're right. In historical context, there were armies who were armies of religious identities, I guess we can say.
Yes.
But at the crux of it was white supremacy.
Yes.
At the crux of colonization was white supremacy. At the crux of what's happening today.
You decoded where I was going.
I got you. This is what I have my academic background in, so I'm very well versed in this topic. But I think, again, like, when we're trying to figure out who stands in solidarity with the Palestinian people today, who stood with us 30 years ago, who stood with us 70 years ago, right? You're looking at the children and the grandchildren of exactly what you're describing right now, who were victims to white supremacy and colonization, right? So I think when I show up to these actions, to these protests, or I come into rooms that are, for Palestinian resistance or Palestinian liberation, a lot of times what do I see? I see the Black community. I see the Indigenous community. I see our Latinx brothers and sisters, right? I see folks who, have had grandparents and parents have a similar upbringing to my grandparents and my parents' upbringings, even if we are halfway across the world from each other. And why? Because of colonization. And when you're thinking of the regions you listed, we can even add Central and South America to that because of Spanish colonization, right? So you think about even like, and Arabs are no different. There is a whole conversation we can have about, the Arab world and how they colonized and all of that kind of stuff. These are parts in history that we need to recognize and acknowledge so that we don't do it again. The problem is that we're continuing this pattern, and there need to be people who recognize it, call it out, and move differently. And the problem that we're having is the people in power are not willing to move differently. They're wanting to uphold white supremacy for their political and financial interest at the expense of who? The Palestinian people, civilians, and not just Palestinian people. Right now it's the Palestinian people. But look around the world. Afghanistan, in the same day that everything happened in Palestine, Israel, there was earthquakes in Afghanistan. A few weeks before that, there were I want to say there were earthquakes in Libya as well. I'm talking about the destruction of the world based on colonization, and these people around the world have been asked to rebuild it so they can live off of shaky foundation at the hands of colonizers, right? And what happens? Natural disasters happen to already disenfranchised people. People die, right? These are the things that we need to be talking about.
I think exactly, and I don't think it was an accident that when Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib was silenced when she appealed to the U.S. Congress that she was flanked by members of the Congressional Black Caucus. I think you tied it all up together. But let's go to October 7th, and the tragedy of October 7th. Why did October 7th occur? I'm aware that Netanyahu and his government was made aware that something was coming as much as a year before, didn't take it serious or what have you. People are scratching their head as to how it happened. What are your thoughts on October 7th, and why would Hamas make such an attack knowing the heavy-handed retributional character of Netanyahu and what was likely to follow? Is that what they wanted to happen? And all that it triggered. Just what are your general thoughts about October 7th? Dr. Alice?
So, first of all, I can't speak for Hamas, and I wouldn't try to. But what I notice historically is that the world does not pay attention to the plight of people living in Gaza when there is no violence. So it is not surprising that a movement that is, partly a movement about being a good Muslim and partly a movement about charitable organizations and hospitals and orphanages and universities, and partly a militant organization, because Hamas is not monolithic, it is not surprising that in a form of resistance would be militant, because that's when the world pays attention. Now, the fact that Hamas could have all of these plans that the Israelis knew and were practicing under their noses along the border. I mean, I was in Gaza. I saw, the Hamas area where they train, and it was right under the nose of an Israeli military installation. So the fact that the Israeli government didn't take this seriously is, first of all, a measure of hubris on the Israeli side. And they're feeling that you could just, every year or two, kill a couple of people in Gaza, smash a couple of hospitals, beat them down, mow the lawn is what they say, and the Gazans would just shut up and just live in their oppressive conditions. So that was Israeli hubris. The other thing was that Netanyahu and his buddies were very interested in what was going on in the West Bank, where there's been an unleashing of very fascistic settler activity that is sometimes joined in with the army, sometimes supported by the army, but they're all the same folks. And they're very intent on kicking more Palestinians out and taking more land and perhaps preparing to annex the West Bank. So the Israeli military and the government were all focused on this activity going on in the West Bank, and they just weren't paying attention. So that is, again, part of the lack of understanding by Israeli leaders that you cannot endlessly oppress people and think they're not going to fight back. So for whatever reasons, Hamas got itself together and had all this weaponry and was able to break through the fence and, seize military installations in several border towns. They didn't know about the music festival, and I think they stumbled upon it accidentally. My understanding, and again, I do not speak for Hamas, is that they plan to take hostages in order to exchange prisoners. And then things got kind of out of hand. I don't know for sure. I do know that there is a lot of concern about the level of destruction that happened, and the Israeli military arrived in full force. And what I've read is that if you look at the charred bodies and the burned cars and the bombed houses, that Hamas arrived with light infantry, and they could never have accomplished all of that. So some of the killing was from the Israeli military response. Whatever it was, this was unacceptable. This is a war crime. This is not acceptable behavior on anyone's part. So it seems to me that that was what was going on. I don't know that anyone could foresee the level of ferocity of the Israeli response, because what you keep talking about the war with Hamas. I would describe it as the war on Gaza, because what the Israelis are doing, the Israeli military, is saying, we try to protect civilians, we give them warnings and all this kind of stuff, and then they bomb hospitals, they blow up schools, they destroy libraries, they destroy universities, they've destroyed something like 60% of the housing. This is not attacking Hamas, this is attacking the people of Gaza. And I don't know that anyone in Gaza thought that it would be quite like that. This is an attack that's orders of magnitude over anything that's happened. It said that the amount of bombing is equivalent to 2 atomic bombs. I mean, the level of like children dying, it just off the scale. And I don't know that anyone foresaw that. And I think the Israeli military is acting partly out of, they got humiliated and now they're really going to, decimate the strip. And, this idea that they could destroy Hamas is crazy. Hamas is a liberation movement. You don't destroy a liberation movement with bombs. The leadership is not in Gaza. And, it's a kind of craziness that's going to just have huge amounts of pain and destruction and death on the civilian population and not accomplish what Israel needs, which is they need to make peace with Palestinians. And you can't get there if you're destroying people and traumatizing people and, families are being wiped out. That's not how you move to a better place. So I think that that's what was going on.
I think, and before I pull Selena back in here, to me, peace is only achieved and sustainable through justice. There is no sustainable peace rooted in injustice. That's the hubris of the oppressor, to think that I can mow the grass, as you said, mow the lawn, and just mow you down. Certainly that was attempted by our people, and keep you in fear, and you will happily, quietly accept your oppression. But it seems from my reading, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the MO has been take advantage of any apparent uprising or resistance, use a high-handed overreaction, certainly nothing that is proportionate to what you're saying triggered it, and then level everything in its wake, and then remove the debris and build another Jewish settlement and continue in what is a very clear plan over time to depopulate in terms of Palestinians and repopulate and replace with Jewish settlements. That it's a process that's been going on pretty much for about 100 years now. Am I wrong in that assessment of the MO and what is going on?
I don't think you're wrong. I think that it happens actually much more often than there are uprisings. I think it happens on a daily basis where there are different methods in which the Israeli government enact the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. When I was there, we actually, on our way to the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, we passed by a woman who was sitting outside her home in a plastic chair. And I had already seen her I've seen her on Instagram, as different Palestinian Instagram pages were highlighting her story. And settlers were upstairs. They had taken over her home, settled in it, or as we would say here, squatted in it with all of her furniture, all of her belongings. And there were more settlers who were screaming profanities at her outside of her home in Jerusalem. And there was actually another Israeli woman who was actually defending her and yelling back at them in Hebrew. So it was this really interesting dynamic that I was ready to like go engage in. And I was my dad was like, it is not safe for me. My dad holds Palestinian identification. So we actually could not, we had to get out of there because if the army came and my dad was there, it would have been really bad for him. But I was watching the displacement of this woman in her home. And this idea is that because it was, when I went home and I was asking my uncles about it and my aunts about it, what was happening, what they have been doing for a long time is finding homes that were rented out pre-1948. And they were saying, because this was rented under British rule or for landlords that no longer exist or are not in the land anymore, you no longer have an active like lease or agreement or contract, and we're taking over your home, and kick them out there's no money that goes into it. And so people are fighting back. Right? We saw it with Sheikh Jarrah, where they were coming in and they were trying to kick Palestinian families out of their homes, and the Palestinians fought back. And so you could say that's an uprising, but is it really an uprising, or is it people defending their homes and their and their families? So I would say when we use certain
you should note that all the Palestinians that owned property in West Jerusalem and have the deeds and all that who got tossed out do not have that same argument. So those Palestinians can't go back to West Jerusalem and say, I lived here in 37, so you've got
Exactly. Exactly. That's a good point too. This idea, and I don't know if you guys have, many of you have seen this as listeners, but this idea of the key. A lot of Palestinians, and a lot of Palestinians home, I think I have like 4 of them hung up on my walls. There's a key, and it's symbolic to the key of my family's homes that they left with when they were either expelled from their homes or they ran for their safety. So in my grandparents' case, on the hills of Al-Malha, so at that time they weren't actually they weren't Israelis because Israel didn't exist. They were just Jewish settlers at the time. So those are the terms I'm going to use for this purpose. But the Jewish settlers that were there were training to expel the Palestinians from their homes. So they were shooting from the hills on the side of my grandma's home. So they were hearing all of the gunshots. They would go hide under the olive trees in the olive groves from the settlers that were there. And the reason they actually ended up leaving was because they could hear the massacre in the town over. And men were coming and they were saying to the families there, they're killing children, they're raping the women, get your families out, get your families out. And so all they took were the clothes on their backs and their key to their home. And they ran for their lives, right? Thinking that in 2 weeks they would be coming back to their homes. So they didn't take anything with them. So this idea that they could once return to their homes, or they could have the contracts. There's actually a lot of them are still in the home. Some people grabbed them, some people didn't. So what happened? It got settled. People were settling in them. The home lives, right? To this day, there's an Israeli family that lives in their home to this day. So these are the methods in which people were expelled from their homes. It wasn't just knocking on the door telling them to leave. They were hearing what a lot of people in Gaza today are hearing, the screams and people under the rubble. Like this has been happening for generations, for decades, right? But I wanted to take it back because I think I wanted to talk about language again, because I think even the idea that this is a war is generous. This is not 2 equal sides at war with each other, right? Dr. Alice, you talked about the structure of Hamas, right? And also you described, I think, really beautifully, like the siege that the Palestinian people have been living under. And when you're thinking about the goods and the idea that, like, I've seen videos in the last few weeks of the different things that have been banned in Gaza, and like chocolates have been banned and wedding dresses have been banned. And I mean, it is just the most random list of things that have been banned entry into Gaza. But when you think about that, it's very hard to think about how advanced weaponry that could do the damage that Dr. Alice was describing earlier, they could potentially do. And I wanted to take it back to October 7th because for Palestinians, we actually had a very different reaction to what was happening. I can tell you just from my own personal reaction, my husband is actually the one that told me what was happening. And immediately I was so tense from fear because I knew what was coming. We as Palestinians, we know if one settler is harmed in Jerusalem or in Hebron or in any city, it is game over for the Palestinian people. There was an attack when we were there on a settlement. There were 3 men that went in, and within 30 minutes, all 3 men, they couldn't even get past the checkpoint. They were killed within 30 minutes of trying to make it into a checkpoint. There's this idea of birds being killed by these. I really think it's hard to imagine, like, as Americans, unless you go and you see these massive walls that have military zones, or like Dr. Alice, maybe you can describe it a little bit better than I can, but they're basically military outposts, right? And they have demilitarized zones in the area that separates Palestinians from Israelis. So there's even land between them, so that if something like Hamas paragliders were to make it over the wall, there is still land that they would have to make it across before they could even get to a settlement. So there's this idea that, like, when birds fly over, because they have such advanced technology, birds get shot down. I mean, imagine birds flying in the sky get shot down because Israel has such advanced technology. thanks to our tax dollars, by the way, that it is so hard. And I think this is where Palestinians were very afraid the few days after, the weeks after, because of the outrage of the global community of what happened on October 7th. But we saw the holes in the story. You're telling me that Hamas paragliders made it out of Gaza, over the wall, were not shot down, and then they were allowed to roam the streets of a settlement for hours. The Israeli military, one of the most advanced militaries in the world, could not find them. They were not killed on sight. They were able to go in, and you had the stories of the beheaded babies and the women that were raped, like just the most horrific stories that you could imagine. But we as Palestinians, as Dr. Alice also described, know that Hamas is actually a religious organization, a religious entity. So now, 75 days later, when we hear the hostages coming out and telling these stories of how they were treated, it's more in line with what we as Palestinians know was Hamas's intent from the beginning, right? Like, they ate the same food that they ate. They were treated well, they were given medicine. They were taken to hospitals if they were injured. There are so many different examples that I can give, but the picture I'm trying to point is that I think Dr. Alice's assessment of, because neither of us are spokespeople for Hamas, so let's keep that clear, but this assessment that Hamas could go get hostages, bring them back to Gaza in hopes that there is an exchange of maybe prisoners, because we know that Palestinian prisoners are hostages. They're taken to Palestinian prisons. They're taken from their homes in the middle of the night. My dad lived through this. This is not a new practice.
Israeli prison. They're taken to Israeli prisons.
They're taken to Israeli prisons. Israeli soldiers will come and ransack a home in the middle of the night, take children, take young adults, take community leaders, take them and have no charges. They'll sit in administrative detention for 6 months, for a year. They'll be taken out. They'll quote unquote mess up or make a mistake. They'll be taken back for a set amount of time. I have family members who have been through that, right? So you have all of these different methods of control over people. And I think, if Hamas is going and saying, we're going to take hostages, because if we have Israelis in Gaza, they won't bomb us. They maybe they don't care about us as Palestinians. Maybe we are subhuman to them. But their people, surely they care enough about that they will not bomb Gaza, right? Again, not that this is at all justifying what happened on October 7th. I wouldn't wish it on anyone for any of this stuff to happen. But again, we're trying to think of when people under occupation are pushed to that level of risking their lives. Also, this idea that let's think about Hamas, the makeup of Hamas for a second, or really any group. When we're thinking about the structure of Hamas, we're talking about over 70% of Hamas individuals are orphans, and orphaned from previous bombings from Israel. So when we're seeing these videos that are very graphic on social media, and I urge you to be uncomfortable as you watch these videos, do not scroll past them, watch them, because it's important that we understand the context. What I want to point out are the kids in these videos as they're watching either they're screaming parents under the rubble, trying to pull them out. They're watching the burials of their family members. We're talking about a bombing that could kill upwards of 30, 40 people of one immediate family in one bombing. So when we're talking about orphans, I know it's really hard to understand that, like in an American context, sometimes orphans just come from a broken home, or, it could happen in many different forms here. For the people of Gaza, if you're orphaned, oftentimes it's from bombings, from previous wars. And when you're thinking about people in their 20s surviving 5 to 6 different wars or bombings, indiscriminate bombings from the Israeli government, it's not hard for them to want to go join a group that will liberate their people.
Well, the United States certainly learned that out of the ashes of the bombings toward Al-Qaeda came ISIS. And, when I look at the movie the franchise Batman. Batman and Joker were created by the same tragedy. And chickens come home to roost. Long protracted inequities create all types. A nation of orphans and amputees, something is going to come out of that you're not going to like. And so I want to get to talk about U.S. policy in this, because both of you, what you got at was that you both landed in a place where, if I heard you right, you're saying that what we saw, and certainly what was reported in the Western media on October 7th, was the tip of the iceberg, and things were not always what they appear to be. That more went on than what met the eye, and certainly that met the Western eye. But I want to talk about U.S. policy and how the United States, because 11 minutes after Israel declared its independence in 1948, Truman endorsed. Why? Why has the United States been so uncritically attached to Israel, despite these horrific realities, despite this, what we called in our civil rights struggle, conscienceless power versus powerless conscience? Race massacres that were called riots, as if they were equal. And they were massacres. And so why has from your perspectives, why has the U.S. policy been this unconditional, uncritical endorsement of whatever the government does and a blind eye to human atrocity? But I want to take in a few questions we have gotten from our online audience, and then I want to come back to you on that.
Actually, we just have one quick one, and actually I was going to keep the conversation going. This has been a very educating conversation to really get us to understand what's really going on. So the only question that actually came in is, it was thought in the past that Palestine and Israel could live side by side with secure and recognized borders. Is everything that's happening now based upon old beliefs, and it's not allowing the new beliefs to take over to allow people to live in peace in any kind of way?
I think Decoded, Digested, and Deciphered, I think what the questioner was trying to say is it realistic at this point in the journey to think that we'll have a two-state solution where they, with this toxic history, can live side by side? Is that possible?
So I would say that in 94 with the Oslo Accords, this is a fraught accord that had a tremendous amount of flaws to it. But that was a time when the idea that there could be two states living side by side was sort of very popular. The problem is that once those accords were signed, it was supposed to be an interim agreement, and in 5 years it was supposed to be, the fruition of all of this work. And very quickly it became clear that the Israeli government had no intentions of allowing a viable state to actually exist. And so I think the idea of a two-state, whether it was good or bad or possible or not, which I don't honestly know, was basically killed by the policies of the Israeli government. So, for instance, you have Jewish settlements being established in the West Bank in what was supposed to be the Palestinian state. You have East Jerusalem annexed to be the, quote, unified capital, eternal capital of Israel, when East Jerusalem was supposed to be the capital of the Palestinian state. You have an unwillingness of the Israeli government to have, a contiguous, defensible place where Palestinians could be. So there's a lot of stuff that went on that have made the two-state solution impossible. I mean, I was just in the West Bank, and it's like Swiss cheese. You have certain roads for Jewish settlers and certain roads for Palestinians. You have two different school systems. You have two different, the military is in charge of the Palestinians. So if they do something, they go to military court where there's a 99% conviction rate. If a Jewish settler does the exact same thing, throws the exact same rock, they get like a don't do that, and that's the end of that. And you have a huge amount of support from not only the Jewish community, but also from Christian Zionists for the settler project. So the role of Christian Zionists should not be underestimated here. But basically what's happened is that the possibility of a two-state solution, I think, has been destroyed by the realities on the ground. And if you look at the, quote, separation wall or apartheid wall, this was supposedly built in response to suicide bombing, but suicide bombing actually stopped before the wall was built. It was a political decision by the forces that were doing that. And what's happened is you have this massive wall that is largely built on West Bank land, so on Palestinian land, and it zigzags and wiggles around so that the settlements that are close to the Green Line, the border, the border from 48 that was a sort of a temporary border. All those Jewish settlements are on the Israeli side, but then you have thousands of Palestinians that are in the seam zone between wiggles of the wall. It's totally insane. And the wall is either this massive concrete structure or an electrified fence that you wouldn't want to get near, that has made, it has sort of invisibilized Palestinians who are living on the West Bank side of the wall. So, there are all these political forces that have gone on that have made a two-state solution really impossible at this point, from my point of view.
If that is the case, then what is peace? What's the definition of peace? Because if there can't be a two-state solution for beyond theory and pragmatically speaking, a one-state solution means second-class or no-class citizenship for Palestinians. If I go on the time capsule and come back 25 years from now, will there be a Palestinian in Palestine? Because I'm seeing genocide, I'm seeing wipeout. And as an American, I see what happened from sea. You guys talk about from the river to the sea, from sea to shining sea. We de-Navajoed America. We de-Seminoled it. We de-Apache'd it. We de-Cherokee'd it. We de-Seneca'd it. I've seen this movie. You can change the names and the context, but it always ends up the same. So
yeah, I think you're asking a question that's going to have to be answered probably in 7 more podcasts. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to what is the peaceful resolution today. I think the parallel you're drawing, though, is exactly where I think that we need to take it. And I think that, unfortunately, and I know this might be an unpopular opinion, and I am with all of the people in spirit that say, but we've made so much progress. But we know, as folks who are working within liberation movements, who work in activist spaces, that sometimes progress is actually hidden by just different methods, right? Like this idea that, progress has been made, there is still discrimination across the board in the US, right? Mm-hmm. We are still not having equal access to education, equal access to resources, equal access to healthcare. We don't have, just to take it on the most basic level, right? When we're trying to figure out healthcare for all, there are other countries who I will not name that America funds that have healthcare systems where healthcare is free. And yet here in the US, who suffers from not having the right access to healthcare?
Poor people, people of color.
For people and people of color, exactly. So when we're thinking about the progress we've made over the last 100 years, over the last 50 years, over the last 200 years, yes, I agree that we've made a lot of progress here in the US as a country, but we can also recognize that maybe the methods have just changed, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe there is still disenfranchisement of communities of color. Maybe it just looks a little bit different. So I just think that when we're talking about how do we get to a place of peace, I think that we can get to a place where the bombings will stop, but the rebuild of this community is going to take I have a hard time imagining what one country will look like where Israeli settlers and the Palestinian people, the indigenous people of that land, could live in harmony. I have a very hard time imagining that. I would hope that it would happen in my lifetime. I have a hard time imagining that without the recognition of the stolen land, without the recognition of the lack of access to water, to food, to basic movement. We talk about we talk about these different things as kind of like inaccessible theories or like things that are kind of hard to understand. But when we're talking about the apartheid wall that Dr. Alice brought up, what that is was actually a wall that cut through Palestinian land. My aunt's land was cut almost in half by this apartheid wall that they had no choice in. Right, and right across, you can see from the rooftop, you see the Israeli military just on the other side of the wall. So this isn't like this far away concept for Palestinian people, that it's this wall that's kind of far away, like from here in Seattle to like the border of Canada. There's not this huge wall that has military there. It's pretty easy, like border crossing. This is a huge wall that people cannot come close to. They will be shot at a lot of times if they come close to it. So these are kind of the concepts we're talking about. When we're talking about roads that can't be accessed, when we went on to Jerusalem, the amount of checkpoints that you have to cross, and my dad, who has Palestinian identity, we call it a Hawiyya, he actually is not allowed into Jerusalem. He was born in Palestine. He's a Palestinian. His parents are Palestinian. His grandparents are Palestinian. He's not allowed into Palestine. For me, as a Palestinian American, because I hold an American passport, I got detained at the land crossing. I was detained for about 4 hours. They wouldn't let me in, no explanation. My husband, who is Samoan with an American passport, he was let in. My stepmom, who has an American passport, was let in. My sister, who's 14, has an American passport, was let in. But I was not let in for some reason. I was detained. Through the checkpoints, it's kind of a toss-up, 50-50. Are you going to be let into Jerusalem today, or are you not? Does your American passport give you some sway, or do they want to make it harder for you so that you don't return, right? But for my dad, he doesn't have a choice. My uncles could not accompany us to Jerusalem because they are not allowed into Jerusalem, even though they live in the city of Bethlehem, which is only 30 minutes away. So when you're thinking about these checkpoints that are heavily armed by Israeli military, these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. They can't even go pray at their holy sites on Fridays or during our holidays because they're not even allowed into the city. They have different roads that they have to access. We had to get on a special bus even to go to Jerusalem that my uncle dropped us off in Bethlehem. So there are definitely different classes of citizens, and depending on what documentation you have, if you even have access to documentation, that affords you certain rights. So how do you break a system like that? Is it do you take the abolitionist approach where you just burn it down and rebuild? Do you reform it? Is it something that has good bones maybe, but we just need to fix it a little bit? What is the approach when there's a group of people that are actually not deemed equal or deemed human, as opposed to the other people that are living on that same land?
Said we would stop.
Let
me say, we said we would stop at 7:15, and I'm assuming that both of you, at a time we can work out, will come back. In fact, I'd like to even host here at the church a community-wide seminar, because we got to do a lot of education on this, because the American public is so duped on this issue. I have worked with some groups like Evangelicals for Middle East Peace. I'm very well aware of the negative and toxic role that Christian Zionists have played in our flawed eschatology becoming the basis of foreign policy. I've been invited countless times to take tours of Israel's where you will be exposed to the worst forms of propaganda, so that you can come back and put pressure on Congress people for pro-Israeli legislation. I refused it every time, because I've said I want to go to Gaza, I want to go to the West Bank, I want a Palestinian tour guide, which summarily meant that I know when you're not coming in. And so, but I want to ask two questions of each of you to treat as much as you can in the next few moments. Number one, Martin King said some people want a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, versus a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. What does a justice-based peace look like for the Palestinian people in the region? If we're not talking about a two-state solution where there's some sort of measurable equity, what then is a justice-based peace? What does it, practically speaking, look like? And then, according to international law and the just war theory that undergirds it, If you break it, you fix it. So when we have invaded nations in the past, we had to engage post-war in nation building. Well, they have destroyed civilian infrastructure. There's no homes or schools or water or wells or hospitals to go home to. Where are these people going to live? You can't rebuild a city overnight. So in the decade, 15, 20 years it takes to lift a nation from the ashes, where are these 2.5 million people going to live? Where are these kids going to go to school? What kind of future will be within their reach or range? Or are they simply going to be another generation of orphans who become magnets for a group like whomever, Hamas or whomever? Where are these people going to live safely, with sanitation, with dignity? What international forces, who's going to pay the bill? Is Israel obligated to pay to rebuild what they destroyed? Does the United States, because of its endorsement, are we morally and legally obligated to help rebuild what we've provided military funding and ammunition for? Practically speaking, if you stopped all the bombing and declared the war, quote unquote, conflict over tomorrow, you still have people who have no place to use the bathroom. So
I would like
what
to,
then?
I would like to start answering. This is a loaded question. I would like, as the Palestinian,
go for it. Go for it.
So what does justice look like? Justice, because sometimes people think of Gaza as like really far away from the West Bank. Like Gaza is just different because it's run by Hamas and all of this propaganda. I'm going to talk to you about the West Bank that is not run by Hamas, and Hamas does not operate within the West Bank. Mm-hmm. They do not have access to their own water. Mm-hmm. Israel controls the water. Israel controls the movement of people. Israel controls every aspect of their life. The schools that they have there. When we talk about the UN is involved in a lot of that building of community there, which we can get into that in a different episode or podcast or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about what is justice, like moving forward, justice for peace, I don't know how you said it exactly, but
a justice-based peace.
A justice-based peace. I think a justice-based peace looks like giving folks agency to live a full life and to be able to have their basic human rights afforded to them. That's bare minimum. Palestinians don't even have that. So let's start there. Let's give them food. Let's give them water. Let's give them shelter. Let's give them safety. Let's give them, as the world community, let's demand that on their behalf, right? And they have been demanding that for 75 years. And the world's community is not standing with them. So let's, as the world's community, stand with them and demand that on their behalf. That's first. Second, I would like to answer your second question about who rebuilds. I'm going to tell you who rebuilds. The Palestinian people rebuild.
With what? With what?
I don't know if you've seen in the last, I urge you to go look at how intuitive the Palestinian people are, how they come up with chargers, how they come up with grills from rubble. I've seen them cook food. They don't have anything to cook with, but they somehow build grills from rocks to cook lentils to feed 20, 30, 40, 50 people. Right? Like the Palestinian people, because they have faced this for decades, they have had to learn how to be intuitive and had to learn how to rebuild. And we can talk about what governments support them, where where money comes from and all of that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, who leads the rebuilding of the Palestinian people? It's the Palestinians. Because the Palestinians, as Dr. Alice mentioned earlier, are extremely educated. We're talking about doctors. We're talking about folks that hold masters. We're talking about pharmacists. We're talking about lawyers. We're talking about engineers. The Palestinian people, even for my husband who went for the first time, he was so surprised because of the way that he's learned about Palestine in the Western world. He was so surprised to see how advanced Palestine actually is, right? We think of this third world country that we hear that term thrown around a lot, but actually the Palestinian people are extremely educated. and they're extremely resourceful because they have had to be.
I
So
get
maybe
that,
it's
but are
not-
you saying that that Israel, that the United States, the allies, that they're off the hook?
Absolutely not. Oh my God, I would never say that in my life. I would, if it were up to me, if it were up to me, I I have a lot to say about that. But these colonizing entities, they have a lot to they owe a lot to the world, not just to the Palestinians,
Yes.
but to many communities across the world. So I would love to see America fund the rebuilding of Gaza. I don't think it will ever happen in my lifetime.
Because short of some intervention, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the short or the near term are going to die from disease, starvation, injuries.
But you have to understand, our own president has said in the past that the best investment that the U.S. has ever made is the state of Israel. So you have to figure out who exactly it is that their supporters are and why it is that they are supporting that this entity, and then understand why they're not ever going to allow Palestinians to get to a position that would be equal to them. Because they know that if Palestinians have access to the basic human needs, they would then have power. And that is a scary thing. That is a scary thing for the US. It's a scary thing for Israel. And so we can talk about that more. That's a much bigger topic to talk about. But I don't think the US would ever allow that to happen. Just as a Palestinian,
America is very much complicit in this story. Dr. Alice, your response to this?
So I think that I agree that this is basically a human rights struggle. And one thing that we haven't mentioned is the word Zionism, which I know is another hot button thing. But I would like people to think about this, that Zionism, which was born as a political ideology in the late 1800s, basically is an ideology of Jewish supremacy. And even though what a lot of Jewish people and Israeli Jews feel that it's a liberation movement for Jews, if you look at it, it's more in the mode of colonial supremacy movement. So I would say that there is not ever going to be, peace with justice or a just peace or however you want to frame it, until Israeli Jews deal with the impact of Zionism and deal with the fact that Zionism is actually, and this is a very unpopular thing to say, is a very racist ideology. That as soon as you say, like the nation state bill, which was passed in Israel, that Jews have supremacy over everyone who is not Jewish, that means that peace is doomed to fail, because you're setting up a country where discrepancies are legally entrenched, where one group of people has a right to self-determination and another group doesn't. And that has to be challenged. And because the United States and other Western allies are such big supporters of Israel, it's never going to be challenged until we hold them accountable. So a lot of this really centers on the U.S. response. And so that's why there's so much work to be done in the U.S., because if we can change some of the behavior of the U.S., then that will have an impact on the state of Israel. This is about racism, it's about supremacy, it's about inequality, and it's a human rights struggle. And that's, it's an anti-apartheid human rights struggle. And I think that that's how we have to look at it. I don't know how it's going to end, but that's where we're at right now.
I would just like to add to that too. One big thing that I think that a lot of us forget as American constituents is that our elections are extremely important in the way that we as the U.S. respond to all things that are foreign relations, right? So we need to get folks in office that really represent what the American people want. And I think what we're seeing right now is that there is a huge shift in the tide of this narrative. Americans are no longer being duped by the propaganda that we've been fed for so long about what is the state of Israel, and what they wanted, their claim to the land and all that kind of stuff. I think that ship has sailed for them, and they're not ever going to win that war anymore with the U.S. So our next, I think, in terms of ending this with like some action items, I think our action item is to really think about who we're going to vote for in the next election cycle, and not just at the presidential level. Who is in our House of Representatives, right? You talked about censuring Rashida Tlaib. Who stood with her? Who stood with Rashida Tlaib? I think we need to have more representation in office of people that really hold values and morals and hold humanity, I think, at the center of how they operate in life. And so I would urge everyone who's listening to really kind of leave thinking about that.
As we've come to the end of our time for today, but have only opened up the conversation. First of all, I want to say it has been a sheer joy, honor, and delight for me to be able to meet and become acquainted with the two of you. You continue my own learning and enlargement of my stream of consciousness on this issue. I live very much in my reality as a person who is a product of a people who have been thingified and objectified and iticized, who have passed down generational trauma, and who still face glass ceilings and invisible and very visible roadblocks. And I can't code switch my way out of this blackness in a white supremacist society. And when I hear these facts, it sounds so similar. It sounds like our own experience in different garments, but it's the same power dynamics. And so my empathy for other people dealing with conscienceless power, and they're affirming their resourcefulness when they're powerless conscience. But there has to be agency, as you say. But I said in my sermon on Sunday, I said, for those of you who think that being opposed to the actions of the Israeli government in relationship to the Palestinian people, that translates into anti-Jewish sentiment. That is not true. As a Christian, I am indebted to the Jewish people, the Jewish faith, for the lawgiver, the prophets, and my Savior. I cannot affirm my own religious identity without affirming and appreciating the Jewish faith and Jewish people. I said, but people who stand against Zionism as a political ideology and to stand against what the Israeli government is doing and has done to the Palestinian people is standing against them because on this issue they're wrong. And wrong, I believe, as an ethicist, that universal norms of justice, equity, empathy, compassion, consistency, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. My Jewish Savior said that there needs to be one set of rules. And when we have that one set of rules, that's when we know we're on solid ground. When there's different rules for this group of people and different rules for that group of people, that's when we know we're into something evil, something demonic. And the rationalizations of race and all of those kinds of things, and gender and identity politics become rationalizations for behavior that is wrong on its face. I'm hoping, and I'm assuming you guys have given me your consent to return, and I want to talk with you when we go off the air, perhaps not today because you've got other things to do, but I want to talk about bringing you back, not only for another podcast, but let's plan something even bigger for our region, because I think there's people out there of goodwill within the Jewish community, the Islamic community, the Christian community, and beyond, people in the non-religious community, black, white, Arab, everything, where people just want a better world, where people are treated humanely. I believe that. I still believe there's more good than there is evil, and there's more light than there is darkness. So let me express my deepest gratitude for you coming and scratching the surface tonight. But this itch goes a lot deeper. So will you ladies come back when it's doable for you?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay. Then let me wish you happy holidays to all of you, however you celebrate them or not celebrate them. To all of your families, blessings and peace, good health and prosperity to you and your loved ones near and far. And let's continue to fight to make this world a better place. We are all God's children. God bless you.
Thank you.
To my audience out there, next week we will be taking a holiday break from Conversations with the Pastor to enjoy the holidays with our family and friends the next 2 weeks, and we will see you back in January. Until then, eat well, but don't eat too much. And whatever you eat, follow it up with a little exercise so that we don't go into the new year dragging more of us into the new year than is manageable. So enjoy your friends, your loved ones, your family. And as we say each week, take care of your wealth, take care of your loved ones, take care of your life. It's a precious gift. God bless you, and happy holidays to all of you.
Thank you for joining Conversations with the Pastor here on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. You can also join us for worship service on Sundays at 9:30, and you know this one's going to be a special one. For Conversations with the Pastor, see you next year.